for our last panel, we're going to focus on another really timely topic, Order 1920, and then looking ahead, what are some of the challenges associated with it, compliance issues that we might see coming up. So we've got a really good panel here to talk us through some of these challenges, and I think they're going to provide an opportunity for questions from the audience. For our moderator for the panel, we're really happy to have Jay Ryan. Jay is a partner in Wires Associate Member Baker Botts, so he's going to lead the discussion today. And we've got three really terrific panelists with very different perspectives on some of these issues. First of all, really pleased to have Karin Herzfeld here with us. She's Senior Transmission Counsel to Chairman Phillips at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And for those a lot of us are familiar with Karin, but for those of you who don't know her, she's been incredibly active on the transmission front at the Commission, and is a leading expert at FERC on a lot of the transmission issues that the Commission's been grappling with. We also have Sonny Raheem. He's a manager of planning policy and research at Wires RTO member, SPP. Pleased to have him here today. And then rounding out the panel, we've got Mike Calviou, Senior VP for U.S. Regulatory Strategy at Wires member, National Grid. So great panel, very interesting perspectives, cutting edge topic, typical wires, right? So Jay, we're going to turn it over to you and get us started with the discussion.
Great, thanks Larry. We're going to dive right in. Karin, maybe you can set the table for the discussion and just give us your perspective on what problems the Commission was trying to solve, and maybe a brief overview of the order for those who haven't read the full 1,300 pages.
Sure. So I'm sure almost everybody in here is very intimately familiar with the rule by now. Probably read it more recently than I have. But just, as an overview, the Commission found that there were deficiencies in the current transmission planning process. There are pockets and certain regions where long-term planning was being conducted, but at least overall, universally, long-term planning wasn't being conducted on the scale, on a national scale. And so the Commission found that over recent years, there's been a lot of piecemeal planning, often through the local planning process or through the interconnection process, and that this was just not the most efficient way for us to build out the grid looking forward over the next 20, 40, 50 years. And then, really in the past couple of years, as we were working on this, the load growth was starting to pop up in the beginning, but it just, really has started to explode in the forecasts. And I think that kind of emphasized the need for this and why we have to do this long-term planning. So just a quick overview to set the stage. I usually think of the rule as having four separate parts. There's the long-term planning. There's a couple planning reforms in the existing Order 1000 processes. There's the cost allocation, the least contentious issue always, and then the local planning reforms and right sizing. And so under the long-term planning, it essentially requires looking out over at least a 20-year time horizon, doing this at least once every 5 years, using a plausible and diverse set of at least three long-term scenarios, and incorporating in those scenarios a list of 7 factors that includes laws affecting the resource mix and demand, state-approved IRPs, trends in fuel costs and resource technologies, retirements, so what's leaving the system, looking at the interconnection queue, what's coming onto the system, and then utility and corporate commitments and policy goals, which has gotten a lot of attention, but is one of the factors that is contributing to the need for transmission. And so then the rule requires that transmission providers measure and use 7 specific reliability and economic benefits. I won't list those, you're probably all very familiar with them. And then after measuring the benefits, the requirement is to have a process for selecting and to include some sort of selection criteria that transmission providers will use to identify the facilities that are the more cost-effective and efficient facilities. There's also a requirement to give states and interconnection customers the opportunity to voluntarily fund the cost of a facility or a portion of a facility. So if the project doesn't meet the benefit cost ratio, but a state finds that it has particular value to it, it can voluntarily fund, for instance, the portion of the project that would bring it above the benefit cost ratio. And then I think everyone here is very familiar with the requirement to reevaluate facilities that were previously selected. So then there's a couple reforms outside of long-term planning. Those are looking at the interconnection queue, seeing which upgrades, large upgrades in particular, have been identified 3 or more times and are not being built, and evaluating whether those should potentially be considered in the planning process. And then also in all of the processes, there's a requirement to look at grid enhancing technologies, not to necessarily implement them, but to consider whether they are appropriate solutions. So dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow, transmission switching, and advanced conductors. Cost allocation, there's honestly not many prescriptive requirements here. Hold a 6-month engagement period with the state entities prior to the compliance filing, file 1 or more ex-ante methods as a backstop, and then allow the states to have a state agreement process as well if they choose, which would allow them to negotiate cost allocation methods up until 6 months after a project is selected. And then finally, the local reforms. There's some requirements on transparency. A lot of it is taken from, or very similar to the PJM attachment M3. You have to hold at least 3 stakeholder meetings per regional cycle about the local process, identify opportunities to right-size local facilities, and then also there is a reinstatement of a federal ROFR for any right-sized facilities. So that's the quick and dirty overview.
So, Mike, net positive? Did the final rule align with expectations? Is there anything that isn't in the rule that you might have wanted to see in there?
Yeah, we're generally very positive about it. We're really pleased to see FERC engaging and progressing on this issue. I think most people in the room understand that a vast amount of transmission infrastructure is going to have to be built. In the states we operate, New England, New York, we have net zero targets leading to large amounts of renewables. National Grid, we also are the major transmission owner in the UK. And so, you know, we look across the pond a lot to see what they're doing. And what's happened over there is they've also got similar ambitious targets. They've got over 15 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed already. And even though they did have a comprehensive planning process, transmission has become a major bottleneck. It's a real challenge that, you know, congestion on the system has gone up by a factor of 10. It's in the billions of pounds every year. Interconnection queues are like 10 to 15 years for a new generation with hundreds of gigawatts of, whether it's wind or storage, it's sitting in the interconnection queues. So transmission planning is absolutely vital because there's a real risk that given the speed and the size of the energy transition that we're going through in certainly our states, that transmission does become a bottleneck given how long it takes to build and deploy. So, doing more on transmission planning, we are very welcome. We think there was a lot of good stuff in there. We do like the expanded right of first refusal for right-sizing projects. We think that makes a lot of sense. We can see a case for, FERC 1 Order 1000 type competition, benefiting customers for new innovative solutions, but when you're just effectively just upgrading an existing line, it makes absolutely no sense to have some sort of RFP process for that. I think there's a case that maybe there could be a bit more on in the ROFR space that's that FERC would have done. But generally, I think it was a positive order. There's more to do. I'm sure we'll come on to that later. But in transmission, particularly because the focus was on regional planning and doesn't get into interregional, but we'll maybe talk about that later.
And Sonny, from an RTO perspective?
Yep, definitely think it was timely. Not saying that just because Karin's sitting next to me, but it's much timely. One example is last time we did our 20th year assessment, we had our 20th year summer peak load amount. Now we're seeing that in a year 2 forecast for our 10-year assessment. That's how much volatility or uncertainty in load forecast is occurring now, which means that we need to plan for transmission in a holistic fashion going forward. Really appreciative of the flexibility that's included in the order, and also the precision and precise requirements on defining benefits for that holistic transmission solution. We have some other initiatives underway at the Southwest Power Pool that are incremental steps to this order. So we think this order plus Order 2023 are foundational steps for the steps we want to take beyond just meeting the long-term horizon. We're looking at ways of pulling in long-term horizon, our annual planning assessment, and the generator interconnection process into one consolidated planning process in the incremental work we're doing. So very timely, very appreciative of FERC and FERC staff for this order.
So jumping into the elements, long-term scenario planning, got to consider 7 factors, 3 of which can't be discounted. Sonny, in terms of how you conduct planning now, how do you use long-term scenario planning? How might it change in response to the order?
Yep. Yeah, it's an excellent question that I thought about a lot before this meeting. So we have criteria today in our development of long-term planning assessments and scenarios. In the SPP terminology, we refer to these as futures. So we look at different trends in generation, retirement, load forecast, electrification, state level policies that are impacting those futures. We do up to 5 in that 20-year assessment. Some of the change that we're expecting under this order is really including those state level entities on the front end of those assumptions. The state level entities in our kind of planning process have been more on the cost allocation inclusion piece, but this order does encourage them to help participate in those forecasts such that we can understand local laws and requirements for those futures. We plan on continuing with a broader range of futures in our compliance approach beyond the 3, and really see those as valuable in setting the holistic transmission vision of the future.
And Mike, outside of the 7 enumerated factors, are there other factors that you think should be considered in long-term scenario planning?
I don't think so. I think Karin, I think FERC did a good job. I think scenario planning makes a lot of sense. Again, particularly when there are state policies driving the generation and resource development. And so, we know there is going to be a large amount of new renewables and probably other resources like storage built. There may be some uncertainty about precisely when and where, but actually thinking through those scenarios and identifying those sort of almost no or low regrets opportunities to actually start doing some of the pre-engineering and permitting for properly needed transmission makes an awful lot of sense. One thing that we do note is that probably, I think the order talks about like a 5-year reevaluation. We actually think, based on our experience, that example in New York, that actually it's probably 3 years would actually fit better with what's going on. So we'll probably be, as part of the process, looking to refine how that scenario is developed. But I think broadly, scenario planning makes a lot of sense given the scale of change that we're seeing, and given the need to really think about, okay, where can we actually start building and deploying the transmission infrastructure so that the grid doesn't become the bottleneck it could be.
And Karin, how much flexibility do transmission providers have to build out those factors?
So obviously the 7 categories are pretty broad. So there's still the flexibility to determine which specific factors within each of the categories are actually incorporated. So there's the discretion to decide that a certain factor does not actually contribute to a long-term transmission need and shouldn't be included. But so for instance, there's one of the categories is expected retirements. So what you consider as contributing to those to the estimate of the expected retirements is up to the transmission provider. So whether you consider the age of the generator, the laws that are contributing to potential retirement, the emissions profile, or the anticipated costs and revenues of a particular facility, that's all up to the transmission provider as to how to account for that. And then there's also more flexibility in how you actually incorporate those into the scenarios. So you could assume that all announced retirements are going to happen under 2 of the scenarios, but not the 3rd scenario. So while there is the categories, I do think there's more flexibility than is maybe immediately obvious.
So once the needs have been identified, then you move into evaluating projects that might solve for those needs. 7 economic and reliability benefits that have to be measured. Same question, I guess. Flexibility in terms of adding additional metrics, maybe weighing some metrics more heavily than others, discounting some.
Yeah, so here there's flexibility in that we didn't say how the benefits should be measured. So I think when it comes to your question of weighing the benefits, a lot of that will be determined by exactly how you decide to measure those benefits, which is completely up to the transmission provider and the stakeholders. And then also, as you said, the 7 are a minimum. Almost everything in this rule is really a floor. And so transmission providers are free to add other benefits. And really the only requirement there is just that they be transparent so that everyone knows what benefits are being considered. So those don't necessarily have to even be justified on compliance as long as it's transparent that they're being considered.
In terms of SPP, how does it currently measure benefits now, and how might that evolve?
Yeah, so today we heavily rely on production cost savings benefits to justify projects for benefit to cost evaluation in both our regional planning annual assessment and the 20-year assessment. That will have to change under this kind of paradigm of looking at multi-value, multi-benefit structure. So we will have to go through an exercise of appropriately identifying the weights and the measurement calculation for these benefits that are listed in the order. Typically, as I mentioned, we've relied on that APC calculation, but now with this order, we'll have to do more than that. The parts of measuring benefit that become a little bit challenging in requirements of this order is the extreme weather benefit. There's multiple ways to calculate that. Most of these models are based on historical events, and value of benefit for loss load is different for different types of customers, different types of entities. And coming to a common range or common amount is a very challenging effort that we're approaching within our regional planning processes today, and hope to borrow from that initiative for our FERC Order 1920 compliance filing. But definitely see extreme weather benefit calculation as one of the more challenging ones to meet.
Mike, in the Northeast, current processes generally align with the rule, or changes on the horizon? And are there any other benefits that you think should be measured?
Yeah, well, I think on the benefits, again, and it was a pretty comprehensive list, so it's hard to sort of come up with many things that wasn't covered in the list. I think there was a list of sort of core benefits and like optional benefits. Like one of the optional benefits is access to lower cost generation. So for the Northeast, I could easily see that being expanded to lower cost or low emissions generation. So, there's been a lot of activity trying to sort of increase the transmission interconnection with our neighbours in Canada to access low cost hydro, and low cost and low emissions. So, but the opportunity for transmission to access low/zero carbon resources as well as low cost is clearly going to be part of the mix for what we're going to look at. In terms of your question, in terms of sort of what does it really mean for New England, New York? I mean, I think we already have pretty good planning processes in place. In New York we have a comprehensive transmission planning process. New England has been working on a long-term transmission planning process. Did a 2050 study. Recently filed and had approved with FERC sort of phase 2 of that, which we'll probably talk in more detail on. So I see it as more like incremental change, building on what's already been done, but ensuring that all of the requirements of the FERC order are met. And I think, making sure that, I think looking at reliability, economics and policy all in one comprehensive process is probably the most important thing that needs to be done, which is sort of like in the past has been almost like let's treat those things as separate issues, and I think thinking about them holistically is absolutely vital.
So the rule requires a 6-month state engagement process. Putting aside cost allocation, state entities have an opportunity to weigh in on evaluation and selection criteria, how these put meat on the bones. Is FERC facilitating any of those discussions between transmission providers and the state entities? And is it fair to say the final rule ended up having more of a process requirement as opposed to a substantive requirement in terms of engaging with the states during this period?
So I wouldn't describe it as moving from a substantive to a process requirement. The proposal in the NOPR was to seek the agreement of relevant state entities. It didn't really provide much more detail on how transmission providers should go about doing that. What does seeking mean? Does that mean you have to obtain it, or do you just have to, make good faith efforts to obtain it? What does agreement mean? Does it mean a unanimous agreement, or does it mean a majority, or is it up to the states, or is it up to the transmission provider? So I really think when we started looking at what was proposed in the NOPR, there's an obligation for FERC to at least provide requirements that we can, clearly assess on compliance. And so we needed to kind of add some meat to the bones, and I think that's how it transformed into, well, here's what the transmission provider, here's the concrete steps the transmission provider should take. They should provide this forum, announce when it's going to start, be transparent about the process and seek the input. But at the end of the day, as everyone here knows very well, transmission providers have the ultimate responsibility under the tariff for transmission planning and in 205 filing rights. And so it is the transmission provider who will be filing the method. And I would hope that all transmission providers would want to file something that states agree to, but FERC really can't require that. So that's kind of how it transformed.
And is the commission interfacing with states now to encourage their active participation?
So I think FERC has to be careful because we can't really get too involved in the pre and during the compliance process for, we might be accused of prejudging, putting our finger on the scale in one direction or the other. But we certainly have been going around talking to states, listening to their concerns, their questions about the rule, encouraging them to get involved and to start getting together and talking to each other.
And Sunny and SPP, what's been the reaction of the states to the order, what do you anticipate the level of engagement will be providing input?
Yeah, so states and SBP support generally the 1920 order and see it very proactive and needed for identifying holistic transmission needs. We're starting our education with our regional state committees, which has representation for commission staff from every state within the SBP footprint, on the order in the state voluntary agreement with generator interconnection customers. So that will be starting soon to get their thoughts on. One of the challenges that our state entities will have is we've been working in the last 2 years on a consolidated planning process proposal, which is looking at inviting the generator interconnection community on the front end of our regional planning process to contribute cost to the overall portfolios. So it's a general contribution to these portfolio upgrades that we would identify through our long-term and annual assessments. So that, I mentioned that because that is one area that our RSC, our Regional State Committee, has been focused in on as a holistic solution to the backlog in generator interconnection and building more transmission on the system. So they'll have a decision to make whether we're going down this path of having voluntary state level agreements with GI customers, or are we going to continue down the cost allocation frontier with the CPP, the consolidated planning process. So that'll be a big decision for them to make as they're getting the education on 1920 starting this month.
And Mike, high level of state engagement in New England?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, in New England, the long-term transmission planning process was recently approved. That process effectively has the ISO doing 2050 studies, identifying needs, and then effectively doing an RFP to sort of find solutions to those needs, and then a heavy role for the states where effectively they sort of will sign off the cost allocation for those projects, and ultimately, assuming they can agree, and ultimately if they don't agree, then perhaps those projects don't go ahead. So the states are already heavily involved. I think it's probably fair to say that some of the states almost felt the 1920 order time was a little unfortunate because it's like they've already just developed something and now they've been told to develop something slightly different. But as I say, I do think we can probably incrementally evolve the LTPP into the 1920 compliant approach. I guess one of the questions that will have to be dealt with is that sort of, if can one state effectively veto a project they don't like, and is that consistent with the sort of the FERC, what's required in the order, which at least I read is there has to be some sort of default cost allocation. So as we always know, cost allocation is where things can get a little bit contentious, but.
So once we figure out what the needs are and the solutions, we got to figure out how to pay for them. Karin, maybe you can just give an overview of the Commission's general cost allocation principles.
Yeah, so like I said before, this is really, I think, the part of the rule that has the least amount in it as far as requirements. All the requirements have already been said before. The cost allocation principles were taken from Order 1000, and they're really based on what's been codified in court precedent, which is that the beneficiary pays, costs must be allocated roughly commensurate with benefits. You can't involuntarily allocate costs to those who don't benefit. The benefit to cost threshold, if there is one, cannot exceed 1.25. The cost must be allocated within the region unless someone outside the region voluntarily agrees to fund it, and then the method must be transparent. So there's one principle 6, which we declined to adopt, and this was really, I think, an oversight in the NOPR that we had included it, because the whole and cost allocation principle 6 is that you can have different methods for different types of facilities. So a cost allocation method for reliability projects, a cost allocation method for economic projects, and another one for public policy projects. And really, this doesn't apply to this rule because of the fundamental nature of what we're doing here, which is holistic planning. So no project is going to be necessarily purely for reliability, purely for economics, or purely for public policy. It may be more one, than the other, but that's just not the nature of what we're doing here. So we've had some discussion about this, and I think the chairman actually had a concurrence in the ISO New England order that we were discussing, essentially saying that this doesn't prohibit transmission providers from separating out different types of benefits within a cost allocation method and allocating the costs of those accordingly. You just can't separate projects out into reliability projects, economic projects. So you still have the flexibility to sort of allocate the benefits differently within your cost allocation method. So I think that's an important clarification.
And Mike, in New England is the expectation that you'll be able to take the existing cost allocation policy and file that as your compliance with Order 1920?
I hope so. I mean, I think on cost allocation, clearly cost allocation has to start on beneficiaries pays as a fundamental principle, but I think there's a real risk of what I would call a spurious precision on beneficiaries pays, because transmission projects get built for multiple years, and the beneficiary, as we all know, with uncertain weather, with lots of intermittent resources, the actual power flows on the system and actually the beneficiaries can change fundamentally, year by year, month by month. And, you might build a transmission project, think it's all about accessing, sort of getting low cost renewables from one part of the system to another, and then actually in a low wind scenario, actually the beneficiaries is going the other way. So there is a real risk of trying to be almost too precise on this. So I do support sort of like the roughly right sort of type approaches. In New England, traditionally for regional projects, we just do a load ratio share. Everybody shares in it, and that's worked well. My expectation is under the new long-term transmission planning process that the states would adopt a similar sort of like for things that they can see is needed for the region. Then effectively everybody will do their fair share, based on the load. I think there clearly then is the opportunity for sort of things that really are only being driven by one state's policies or something like that, for then, sort of do some sort of variation where one state may pick up the lion's share or even all of something. But I think, sort of like those sort of like broad recognizing that transmission generally does benefit the entire system approaches are, make most sense. That's not to say there will not be intensive stakeholder discussions around the precise details of how to do it.
And something at SPP, can you talk about the current cost allocation policy and how that might fit or might not fit with the Order 1920 requirements?
Yeah, sure thing. So definitely appreciative of FERC and FERC staff including roughly commensurate with benefit. That is very comparable to how we perform our SPP highway and byway cost allocation methodology. Highway being that is 300 kV and above. That cost is typically on a load ratio share with the whole region. And then byways is below that 300 kV threshold, and it's funded more of a local benefit, local cost driven upgrades. So that framework in itself can give us a baseline ex-ante method for the long-term planning assessment. We do believe that this roughly commensurate with benefit structure is very important, that we realize that it's roughly commensurate in this study, and then over time, as the system is changing, as you're building more transmission, benefits are going to change over each cycle of this long-term planning assessment that we perform. So we also do a review of cost allocation benefits at the end of our planning cycles that we refer to as the RCAR. That really helps us prove that costs are commensurate with the benefits that are received over time. So we'd like to continue using those structures as a baseline for meeting the ex-ante cost allocation approach under Order 1920.
And is there an existing state agreement process in SPP now? And if not, what's your expectation as to whether?
Currently, there is not a state level agreement process with generator interconnection customers as a direct product in our tariff and business practices. However, there are frameworks that are available that can be utilized to meet that requirement should the regional state committees choose to do so. We have a program or a framework called the sponsored upgrade process, so a person or entity can sponsor an upgrade and get a cost allocation agreement with load. That framework can be utilized under this requirement. We do have some challenges with that approach. We want to make sure that we're planning the region as a whole. So if we have this state level volunteer program, states may execute on upgrades that we want to make sure fit the vision of the region. That's one challenge that we have with that voluntary requirement, is to make sure that those upgrades fit the region and the forecast that we need for 20 years. We don't want it to create an inadvertent consequence of having kind of a piecemeal approach on a state level.
Reevaluation of projects.
Everyone's favorite.
All right. So how are you thinking about the reevaluation? Is it going to be a fairly routine process, or does the commission think this should be a fairly high threshold before we start reevaluating projects? How are you thinking about it?
So this is definitely not intended to be a frequent occurrence. That's not what we were intending. I think that's why, I know there's a lot of concerns about this particular proposal, but ironically, we actually were thinking of this as a little bit of a loosening of the proposal that was in the NOPR. So the original NOPR proposal was that transmission providers could subject the selection status of a project to the outcome of subsequent cycles. And so that was basically conditioning the selection on a routine basis, essentially. And we thought that would introduce way too much uncertainty if there were constant projects were constantly changing based on what was being selected in the next cycle. And I think another benefit that we saw to the reevaluation was that it might be more likely for some of these projects, especially large, expensive lines, to actually be selected and supported by states and other stakeholders if they knew that there is at least this sort of backstop that there will be some sort of reassessment if there's a significant increase in the costs, a significant delay that could affect the ability to meet the reliability need, or a significant change in law that actually changed the need for a line, which I think would be probably the sort of least frequent circumstance to occur. So the triggers we set out were intended to at least be narrow, and I know there's concerns about the prescriptiveness of this part of the proposal. At least the intent behind that was to try to make this narrow so that it wouldn't turn into like I said, a routine reassessment that's happening frequently. And we did leave flexibility to transmission providers to determine when one of the triggers actually occurs. And then that's also why we built in the requirement that transmission providers have to designate a point in time after which a project just cannot be reevaluated. That's another kind of safeguard that we built in.
Mike, any other guardrails you'd like to see as part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an area that there are clearly concerns around. I mean, I think we can understand that sort of like there are scenarios where you do need do something, in a scenario that a project is awarded to either incumbent or competitive provider, and then that project gets stuck in a sort of permitting sort of process and isn't moving forward for multiple years, at some point you probably do need to take stock and say, does it really make sense to continue with this project, or are there better solutions, etc. But as I think Karin recognised, that actually, transmission development is a long, complicated, costly process. Whether it's doing all of the pre-engineering, the environmental surveys, engaging the supply chain, once you think a project is effectively go, then to sort of still have the uncertainty of, that project may suddenly get sort of like reevaluated in a year or two because suddenly the benefits case is slightly changed, would be massively unhelpful and actually just drive costs and uncertainty. So it needs to be a very high bar. So I agree that, I welcome the way Karin describes it. I think we just need to make sure that's how it gets translated in practice. It just doesn't become every year or two, everything's like being thrown up in the air, and projects that are sort of in flight already suddenly saying, there's a better option now, let's jump from this horse to this horse, which would just clearly make absolutely no sense. So I think it needs to be a very high bar, very clear criteria, and and provide as much certainty so that those of us who are trying to build these big complicated projects, once we know it's a go, then we can really go.
Sunny, in terms of the reevaluation process in SPP, how does it look today? How might it change? How frequently are you using it?
Yeah, so reevaluation process in SPP, it's performed on a quarterly reporting tracking system. So every quarter, that constructing transmission owner has to report cost and schedule back to SPP. Based on those costs, primarily costs, there could be a situation where that triggers an NTC notification to construct a reevaluation. So if costs go above the thresholds, the margins that we agreed to in the original study, that could open up the door for reevaluating that project. The order does include delays of projects, which is very timely with the supply chain issues that we have going on, and that gives us an opportunity to revisit our current standards at SPP to look at ways of encouraging timely construction of projects. There are certain things that are outside the control of that constructing entity that we have to be considerate of. Maybe the contracts or the materials that they're ordering are well beyond their control. Siting, permitting, that can be outside their control for environmental issues. Those are ways that we're looking at other creative ways to supplement delays. We've met with our strategic planning committee to come up with the best placement for grid enhancement technologies, and we see that as a placement to supplement delays, is evaluating grid enhancement technologies or non-transmission solutions as a way to supplement those delays, to make sure we're not adding congestion and alleviating that in the short term while we wait on these wires in the ground kind of scenarios. So got a little bit of work to do on the delays, including that into a reevaluation process, but have a good start on cost estimate reevaluation that exists today.
You okay for questions?
I'll take a question, sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's Craig Gladen, PJM. This is more just sort of an awareness comment here. I wanted to, Larry's coming at me here. The hook will come out. We often forget the third branch of government, namely the courts. And I just wanted the Wires Group to be aware, there is a case right now in the Court of Appeals, Third Circuit Court of Appeals, that could fundamentally change Order 1920, frankly, and the premise of it, depending on how it comes out. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, which is why I want to bring it up here. Case involves a project that AEP had put forward in Pennsylvania to address congestion issues in Pennsylvania and Maryland. The Pennsylvania PUC refused to cite the project, not on any environmental basis, but on the basis that there was not shown to be sufficient need within the state of Pennsylvania for the line, notwithstanding that there was clearly a regional need to address the issues that the line was attempting to resolve, including impacts across the border in Maryland. we got a positive, it's gone on for years, we got a positive, and AEP is very involved in this, we got a positive decision from the district judge. It's now on the Court of Appeals. If we lose that case, that basically then says that a state, putting aside cost allocation, a state can decide that its own statewide needs can sort of override a determination of regional need. And a project then doesn't have to go, can't go forward. So it's a pretty big deal in terms of that. So I just wanted to bring it to people's attention. I think there's a difference between whether Pennsylvania has to pay for a line for which it doesn't benefit, but whether it can stop a line that for which it arguably does not benefit on a statewide basis. So people don't necessarily track Court of Appeals decisions. When this case comes down, it could be a very big deal that frankly could upend a lot of the premises of Order 1920 for more regional long-term planning. So I just wanted to bring it to folks' attention.
So Larry, just to make sure we have enough time for questions, why don't we open it up? And I have other questions, but...
That sounds good. Are there other questions folks have for the panel? Yep, Abe.
Hi, Abe Silverman. Great presentation. I wonder if you can all sort of talk about how your utilities are engaging on this cost allocation and the ex-ante process. I work with a lot of states, and my sense is there haven't been a lot of discussions going on that have actually like sort of taken a more formal process. Can you talk about sort of both how FERC may have envisioned that process to work, but then also how you're seeing it play out in your respective regions?
So at least from how FERC envisioned, I think one of the reasons that we left that section of the rule very bare as far as requirements is because there needs to be flexibility among the regions. Everyone's sort of in a different place, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned the highway, byway, SPP, MISO. I think some of the regions do have cost allocation methods that they could potentially come in and file tomorrow if they wanted as their ex-ante, but they also will now have the opportunity to consider a state agreement process. ISO New England, was well on its way to coming up with its own sort of state agreement process that includes even more of a state role than Order 1920. PJM obviously has its state agreement process, and we'll probably need to work on an ex-ante. But I think, at least from FERC's perspective, we tried to leave as much flexibility for each region to kind of come up with the optimal solution.
Yeah, I mean, I've got not much more to add. Obviously, in New York, it's a single state ISO, so, not so many issues. I mean, there are still massive debates over cost allocation, but it's like upstate versus downstate, sort of, and it's clearly within at least one jurisdiction. I think, as I mentioned, in New England, the New England states have been working with the ISO on the long-term transmission plan and coming up with an approach. I think with the 1920 compliance process now and sort of, how we develop that, I think there'll be lots of engagement with all the stakeholders, including the state representatives. So I anticipate we will, get to something that, generally sort of like, hopefully there'll be a, broad sign-on, if not sort of vocal agreement.
Yeah, not much to add there. We do have the ability to file our highway byway as an ex-ante for Order 1920 for the long-term funding of upgrades on a benefit-based approach. The state level agreement is where I would anticipate a lot of discussion occurring in upcoming regional state committee meetings at SPP. And a lot of that discussion is going to be around our concurrent efforts and initiatives that are going on with the consolidated planning process. So they are involved in a lot of our cost allocation reviews and improvements already, and this will be another item to add to their plate to resolve for helping accelerate the generator interconnection queue, in preparation for growing resource adequacy needs and our ever-growing load forecast that we currently have.
Devin McMacken, ITC. Thanks to everyone for being here and for the discussion. One of the aspects of the rule that I think might be really important but hasn't been discussed quite as much is the requirement to establish criteria for project selection. Because that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? After all the planning and the benefits assessments, it's choosing which projects are going to be approved. And I think that's been a deficiency of some long-term planning processes, is there's not that mechanism at the end of it to really decide. So I guess my question for Karin is, could you talk more about the FERC's thinking in the way they develop that provision, and maybe also any thoughts about how FERC might judge, what criteria is sufficient? And then for SPP in New York, have you given thought to what the criteria might look like, whether it's project by project or maybe portfolio approaches or things like that?
Yeah, so again, here we left a lot of flexibility, specifically allowed for portfolio or project by project approaches. One of the cost allocation principles is the benefit cost ratio can't exceed 1.25, so that, if you want to go that route, that there's clearly a route for that. The selection criteria, there's a lot of people within and outside of FERC that probably would have wanted an actual selection mandate, because, at the end of the day, you can evaluate and look at the criteria, but potentially just not select anything at all. But I think that's really just up to the regions. They could always add in a requirement that if criteria is met, a project will actually be selected. That's just not something that FERC imposed.
I can go next. Excellent question, by the way. So for selection criteria, the approach that we've used historically is on a project basis, starting out. So this project fixes this need. It's kind of a least cost initial look at the portfolio. And as that portfolio matures, we start shifting the target more to the most cost effective portfolio. So it takes the pairing of need and project away, and it groups it together on a multi-value driven approach. That's how we've formulated it so far. The changes I anticipate under 1920, there's requirements to pull in those 7 prescribed benefits at a minimum into that selection criteria. So we have some policy decisions to make there on, is that still the same approach? Do the weighting of those 7 criteria, 7 benefits need to be considered as we're doing our most cost-effective portfolio work?
Yeah, probably the only thing to add is, hopefully in most cases, if you're doing a sort of project by project assessment, then the best project is, the one with the best benefits, however the benefits are defined. Clearly you can come up with scenarios where maybe you have a sort of like, 2 beneficial projects, one with a better ratio than the other, but maybe one can be delivered quicker, and then you come to how do you take the judgment in those things, and the question is how much you should specify them. One debate that I know has been happening in the New England long-term planning process has been about whether people should be able to bid in like partial projects and sort of like effectively, Karin told me not to talk about this, so yeah. But but where we got to in the process was effectively sort of saying no, let's bid in complete projects, and I think with the basis that if people then want to partner together to come up with collaborative solutions, and that's probably a better way than sort of having the ISO trying to piece together different things. But anyway, I'm sorry, Karin.
Good morning, everybody. Chris Kazowitz from Power Engineers. I want to try to frame the context of the last panel in terms of 1920. We've been participating in the FERC 896 workshops recently. I wonder if you could comment on potential synergies between, looking at FERC 896 in the context of your long-range planning process in 1920.
I can get started. So another great question. Extreme weather was a very important piece to us, piece that we started working on immediately after the winter weather storms from an operational communication awareness perspective and also planning. So before Order 1920 came out, we were already working on a 10-year plan, a 10-year planning horizon study to look at what we call resiliency condition. When we came up with the definition of lower frequency, high impact, lower frequency is getting more frequent now. So we developed scenarios into our planning horizon to look at those time periods where it's most vulnerable from that high impact and replace our simulation results with those. We call them resiliency conditions. We've already started working on the policy to include those into our planning assessments in the 10-year horizon. And we plan on using that kind of approach for the 20-year look, where things get a little bit different in the 20-year look, is you're going to have to estimate even further out on the predictability of storms or general trends that you see. I think that's where we'll have to focus our work under 1920, but we've already established a process that helps us look at these variations in extreme conditions that we hope to utilize for longer term planning.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Jay, why don't you do a...
I've got one more question.
Do your wrap up.
While we have Karin.
Yeah.
So, transmission planning, cost allocations out of the way. Still some issues hanging out there. ROE, I think FERC just represented in court that MISO ROE is coming out in 120 days. Transmission incentives in the regional planning. Has the chair indicated what the next priority is?
So we do have one commissioner who has some strong views on transmission incentives, has had quite a few statements recently on that. I think we'll have to see, now that we have the new commissioners, where each of them are on that. As far as what we're focusing on in the near term, the chairman has said this, but we're really closely following NERC's process on the interregional transfer capability study. We have FERC staff who have been advising along with others from the industry and other agencies. And so that's something that we're not necessarily planning to wait until we get those results to decide to kickstart some kind of process. We do need to at least start building a record. Right now, all we did was had a workshop and we got post-workshop comments, but beyond that, we really don't have much of a record. So our plan is to work in parallel. We're working on it right now to start having a proceeding that will be able to incorporate those results. And then we are also having the interconnection workshops in September, 2 days of a staff-led workshop. I know Jim Robb was saying there's 2 terawatts of capacity waiting to interconnect and 1 terawatt of capacity on the grid. So that's part of the reason why we want to look at how do we allocate the scarce capacity that we have? How do we potentially prioritize resources? Because at some point, we will have to prioritize somebody over another. There's just not enough space. How to integrate transmission planning with the interconnection process, and I'm sure SPP will have a lot to say about that. And then automation and how we can employ artificial intelligence and automation technologies to hopefully speed up the processes. So those are on the horizon.
And for Sunny and Mike, anything that you'd like to see come out of the commission?
I mean, I think that was a pretty good list from Karin, actually. But I mean, of the ones she mentioned, interregional, I think, is vital. Sort of the 1920 is great, but clearly it's only within region. Given the amount of transmission, a lot of it is going to have to be interregional, particularly here in the northeast. At some point, with the amount of offshore wind being developed, we're going to need an offshore grid. That, by definition, will be interregional. It has to touch New England, New York, New Jersey, and plenty further than that. So, and there's no no real way for sort of like, who's actually designing that, how does it get built? So, it's a lot to do in that space, but at least starting to sort of talk about how to do interregional in general, and particularly the challenges of an offshore grid. And I absolutely agree that I think looking at generator interconnection and transmission planning as a more integrated whole makes a lot of sense. It does feel as though there's sort of two parallel processes sometimes at the moment. And, given large interconnection queues, etc., I think there is a need for reform, and, we're certainly hoping to participate in the September workshop on talk further on that.
Fully agree with the interregional transfer capability study and placement of priority on that. And in addition to the regional transmission planning and generator interconnection processes, they do feel a little parallel in both processing and also the cost allocation targets. Generator interconnection is generally on a least cost target with but-for reliable interconnection guiding principles, and your regional planning processes are generally more towards a cost-effective portfolio. Those two sometimes don't meet in the middle and aim at the right transmission. So we're definitely interested in that discussion, and definitely agree with Karin and FERC staff on the priorities, and look forward to the September workshop.
Great. Well, join me in thanking this panel for a really interesting and that's going to bring our program for the Sunday meeting to a close. I want to thank everybody for being here. We do have lunch available over in the last hurrah for people who are interested in getting lunch. For those of you who are going to join us for the Line Vision open house, we'll be leaving at 1:30. There's going to be a bus over at the School Street entrance to the hotel. So 1:30 for those who are going over to the Line Vision tour and reception. Thanks everybody for being here. Our fall meeting is going to be in Washington, D.C. on October 30th and 31st. Yes, that's Halloween, but we will get the program wrapped up so folks can get out of there and get home in time for all the trick-or-treaters. So thank you all for coming here today. Thank the panel for being here, and we look forward to seeing everybody at the fall meeting. Thank you.